so much. And thank you for having us today. This webinar is titled How to Lead in a Crisis. So we are going to be looking at and talking of how to communicate and make quick decisions at the beginning of a crisis. My name is Ann Spear. I am co-founder along with Romina DaCosta of Epiko. Epiko is a company that helps with leadership training to build successful team and positive workplace culture in organizations. I have studied and written about leadership for 5 years, but most importantly for this webinar on crisis leadership is I've been involved in leading and responding to crises when I was working at a youth correctional facility in the United States. So I was in situations where poor communications at the beginning of the crisis put me in danger and could have cost me my life. Epiko's goals for webinars like this is to always leave you with something that you can take away and apply immediately for positive results. Our approach actually with organizations is to avoid removing you from your workplace to attend separate trainings or conferences. We prefer actually working where you work as you work. But in cases like today, we do believe that webinars can afford us the opportunity to come together as a community and discuss topics that we all have in common, such as a crisis that the world is facing today. Oh, excuse me. So I always like to start with a good story. In August 2010, 33 miners were working in the San Jose gold and copper mine in Chile. They were 700 meters deep and 5 kilometers away from the entrance when they got trapped. The Chilean president, Sebastian Piñar, and his mining minister, Lawrence Goldburn, were the two main people to respond to the crisis. They had only been in positions since March, so they had no established reputation among the people. The president immediately took the task of communicating. He held press conferences, interviews, gave regular updates. He immediately requested expertise from other countries to come and engage in the rescue operations. Meanwhile, the mining minister was on the ground organizing the operational teams. He clearly defined the situational problems after meeting with experts, and then he began to organize clear roles for volunteer teams. Goldenberg followed the leadership playbook successfully, but he did more than that. What he did beyond applying the strategies that he learned in his MBA program was that he remembered the human side of the tragedy. So despite the overwhelming and time-consuming task of making decisions for the actual rescue, he organized temporary housings for all 33 families at the mining site. Today, I will present a leadership model based on proven scholarly research. But as leaders in the time of crisis, we cannot forget the importance of the human connection when we start responding and throughout a crisis. So I'm fairly positive that most of you have experienced crisis of some type in your organizations. Most of the time, we don't know when a crisis will hit, but we can still prepare for crises by putting certain things in place. Whether a crisis is anticipated or not, we need to take certain actions when it hits. So a crisis hits. What you should do first is pause, no matter how hard it is, and then immediately evaluate your team. Now, I know this might not be the most typical advice, but bear with me. First, positional leadership is never so much as important as it is in a crisis. Just think about what we're going through now and the effects that positional leaders are having in the response of COVID-19. If you are in that role, then get ready to shine because it is your time. But before you can shine, you have to assess your team and know it. As a leader, you will want to reaffirm or reestablish or reorganize your leadership team and the role assignments that they're playing, which might be different from the things that they do in an ordinary situation, and it might change again as the crisis unfolds. We often do not talk enough about the influential and informal leaders among the teams and groups and organizations. It's often easier in everyday life to ignore them or not deal with them, but they are very important in a crisis, and it's important to identify them quickly. It's not the time to have power struggles or negative naysayers, so you want to keep them close and understand whether their influence is positive or negative in response to the crisis. So a quick example of this, of why this awareness can lead to a greater chance of success, is the Shackleton expedition. So Ernest Shackleton led an expedition in 1914 in an attempt to be the first explorer to reach the South Pole. He set off his crew after being warned of the deep ice that winter, and sure enough, his boat got stuck in the ice. But he also led his crew out, so he is credited with getting everyone safely out of a crisis situation. He knew the power of his position, and he often wrote in his journals about the importance of managing his own fears and emotions, of shifting his goals, making quick decisions, and planning as the crisis unfolded and changed. He also wrote about how he organized his crew and made them keep routines, made decisions, both as a way to keep order, but also to manage their fears and disappointments. Shackleton noted in his diary specifically of the naysayers. He understood that these men had potential to be negative influences among the crew. So what did he do? He assigned them to his tent and his direct team as a way to influence them and secure their buy-in and trust. So in times like this, it may be tempting to keep your most trusted subordinates, the people you work the best with and understand you the most, closest to you. But this actually might be better to take that time to allow them to go out beyond your gaze as you trust them, and keep those that you don't know as well by your side. In many cases, you might have a crisis response team trained and ready. In other cases, in other organizations, there might not be. But even with the crisis response team in place, you will not know what you need for each crisis. Today, you need a public health expert. In Chile, they needed space engineers. So what you most likely can count on is working with a diverse team in a complex dynamic situation. So fast forward nearly 100 years later, in deep in a mine in Chile, 33 miners were being led by the foreman Luis Yorzuri. He quickly organized every miner with a job as they stayed trapped under the earth. One became a religious leader, others to see potential ways out. A few others organized their living space. Lewis knew that he had to organize work shifts, give each miner responsibilities to keep them busy, as well as improve their optimism of getting out. He rightfully believed that this would keep the discipline of the miners for them to survive. So one of the things that we often do not think about is how we should be messaging our communication. We want to immediately start communicating and messaging, but it is imperative to take control of the messages that your organization is sending. And you want to control how the crisis is thought of, how it's talked about, how it's interpreted, both by the people in the teams in your organization and those on the outside. So in the case of Shackleton's expedition that ended up stuck on the ice, Shackleton was the blame for the situation. He had been specifically warned that this would happen. So why was he not down in history for the man who led them into danger? But instead, he is remembered for leading them all out to safety. It is because he was very effective in managing the message of the crisis. Through his leadership, he was able to communicate to the men that he could get them safely and quickly out. It was also likely that he built strong relationships with the men before leaving the land. Similarly, Luis, the Chilean mine shift leader, had a reputation for protecting and caring for his team. According to a former employee, he demonstrated loyalty to his crew, and in return, they trusted him. It's this ability that allowed him to quickly reassure the men and allow the men to follow his directions, such as rationing 2 days of food for the entire 17 days that they were stuck underground. So In order to be able to understand what type of message to be sending, you need to take some steps in evaluating the situation and how blame might or might not be attributed to you as a leader and to the organization. So tangible steps are always good, especially in a crisis, because you have to think less about it and you can go through the motions quickly. We draw from the situational crisis communication theory, or SCCT for short, which lays out some directions. So everyone seeks to make meaning when we're in a crisis. And the very first thing that a leader must do in a crisis is manage that meaning making in order for the next steps to be successful, which is collecting information and facts and then making rapid decisions to start responding. So the SCCT theory, it's developed for businesses who sought to manage managers and messages in order to positively keep their positive reputation for shareholders. So they wanted to avoid losing money during a crisis. And it usually was internal crises, such as a factory explosion or a harassment charge. So Epiko, we've taken this theory and based on analysis of numerous crisis responses, we've applied it to our work with the diversity of organizations. So whether you're a government organization, on a police force, or a corporation, how you communicate the crisis is going to depend on how the blame is or is not attributed to you and how it will affect your reputation. We all know that blame and reputation is important to your ability to be able to effectively address the crisis safely. So as you'll see on this slide, the first step is to understand the type and category of the crisis because that is going to create different messages. By naming the type of the crisis, for example, if everyone's a victim, a natural disaster, no one caused it, right? Or if it was preventable and perhaps it was the fault of your organization in which you lead. In that case, you're going to have to take quick responsibility, establish empathy, work to organize the crisis. And you'll need a successful team to do that. This will allow you to generate trust and confidence and the capacity to be able to respond to a crisis, even if it was your fault. There's two more steps that I like to address, and this has to do with the history and the reputation of the organization that you're leading. So in step 2, you will want to understand if you have a strong history of occurrence of crisis. So if there is consistent crisis in your organization, meaning there's a high frequency of crisis. So for example, every 6 months, there is a tragedy due to a technical failure. So as we saw in step 1, this would be accidental, a very minimal risk of blame attribution towards you, except if it's constantly happening, then there's going to be a higher risk of blame and the message will be needed to be different. However, if there is a distinctiveness or a success of history of crisis management within your organization that has shown that there can be a level of trust of how you will respond to the crisis in a positive way, then you will automatically get a more trusting audience for your message. So higher distinctiveness indicates a better job of managing the crisis. So evaluating this is going to help you know how to frame the message. So what's your organization's track record? Do you need to indicate a move away from how things were mishandled in the past? Do you need to reassure that you will continue to do the good things that you did in the past? So let's look at the evaluation charts. If you have high consistency but low distinction, you know that you are going to be talking and communicating with a largely distrusting audience, perhaps for good reason. However, if you evaluate that you have low consistency and high distinctiveness, then you will be able to know that you have an ideal history to move forward in a strong reputation and trust among your audience. So once you work through these 3 steps, you are ready to formalize the strategic messaging to be able to give to both inside your organization and outside. You need the trust of both. And that will be able to communicate the confidence, the understanding, the safety. And you also don't want to forget that human connection that I mentioned. So being genuine and transparent in that messaging is going to provide comfort and allow people to make meaning of a scary and perhaps dangerous time. Excuse me, hold 1 second. All right, so I was tempted, perhaps I shouldn't have, I'm glad I didn't, there would have been technical difficulties perhaps, but I was thinking about playing Walk This Way, well that's Aerosmith, but a good entry for the Rolling Stones. So why do I have a picture of the Rolling Stones performing as we're talking about leadership crisis? But if you stop and think about it, they have a legendary ability to play breathtaking concerts, which can somewhat be compared to the performance of special forces in a rescue mission. Okay, so the importance and the risk cannot be compared. But think back to the actual performing as a group, as a team. The preparation that is needed for both groups to perform in sync is similar. When asked about how they coordinate on stage, that really appears so natural for the Rolling Stones. Keith Richard claims that he's able to look at the left hand of Watts to know exactly what he's going to do. And he also says that one that Woods is going to communicate how they can get back on pace. So what makes the Rolling Stones a great team? If you read the magazine, The Rolling Stones, you know that they don't always get along or always like each other. Some personality differences that has come out in their history. But they make a great team because they prepare and practice and they have distinct roles. So before they tour each time, they reportedly spend 2 months practicing and playing before the tour. In a crisis, you can't do that. We can't prepare for 2 months with our teams for a crisis event. Of course, we can do the drills and the procedures to have our teams at a head start, but that might not always be the case too. So the one word that's been applied to the current COVID-19 crisis is unprecedented, which means that we've never had to deal with something quite like this. So we just don't have a playbook for it. But what you can do is assess your team and conduct an internal evaluation of the risk for the blame attribution, the leadership history and reputation, just like I reviewed. And then you can have some insight into the dynamics of your team, which is going to directly relate to the next steps we're going to go over, which is the information gathering and decision making. You're going to want to ask yourself, how many experts do I have on my team? What is their expertise in? What is the level of trust that they have in my leadership? How is my message going to allow this team to open up and share and collaborate with me and the other leadership? Do you know what the culture is of your team? If you don't, you need to bring someone in who can tell you. That might be a trusted subordinate who's among the ranks and is hearing what others are saying, or someone from the outside who has been especially trained to assess teams. I'll give you a tip though. One quick, honest way of understanding where your team is at is to reflect on regular meetings. Does your team speak freely in front of the leadership? Is there a top-down approach when you conduct meetings and just getting the information? Is there questions or is there silence at the end of a meeting when it's for Q&A? Do you hear things that you disagree with? If there's not open discussions at regular meetings, it's likely that you will not get open discussions in a crisis intervention meeting. And you will need to be very strategic about the next steps, because you'll need your team to be open and trustworthy with your leadership team. So you will need to make sure that you build this and establish this so that you can get the right facts and all of the facts when you're making the decisions. So here's a bit of a process of how you can get effective information in order to make decisions. So much like an emergency medical team in an emergency room, they rapidly assemble and share information about a new patient's conditions in order to effectively manage the emergency medical situation. It is like that as a team responding to a crisis in an organization. You have to establish communication structures and start sharing accurate information. But beyond just sharing facts, you have to know how those facts are interpreted to be crucial. So if a team is going to effectively respond to a crisis, you need to be on the same page about what information is and what that means, and then what the appropriate response is for that information. So if we go back to the example of the emergency medical team, you can find the information that the patient had a heart attack, but then you will need to interpret that information. So is that heart attack caused by a shock or a heart attack? Because that's going to determine what type of care you give them and the likelihood that they'll survive. So one important study that I'd like to present here was conducted in looking at the decision-making process of high and low performing teams in crisis. What it revealed was that in low performing teams, they took a long time making decisions. Now, sometimes we are taught to be cautious and be thoughtful and slow in our decision making. But what the high performing teams did is they took a long time sharing information and interpreting that information. So this suggests that spending time sharing the facts of the situation and then the collective understanding and interpretation and discussion of those facts is going to allow the leadership team to make quick decisions. The high performing teams made rapid decisions. So if you'll notice, the common theme of this presentation has been structure and intentional strategy when beginning to address a crisis. Pause, as I keep saying, because if you move fast and are sloppy, it can be dangerous or at a very minimum, clumsy. So you want to make sure that you go into an information gathering situation with a communication structure in place. Probably similar to how you conduct a regular meeting in everyday organization life. You want to establish whether you will do a Q&A with experts and get information and facts that way, or will it be a roundtable? What the research shows is it's not about how the communication is structured, is that you have a structure in place to share that communication. So as long as there's honest and open fact sharing and collaboration, you will have a good discussion. So this model, as you can see, gives us 3 phases of the information sharing that we should try and adopt with our teams. The first is obvious, fact sharing. The most facts you can get, better your decisions can make. What we can sometimes leave out, or at least exclude our teams from, is the interpretation and the projection. So the interpretation for high performing teams that make the best decision-making responses in crisis show that they take time within their team to collaborate after the fact sharing in order to make sure that different perspectives are collaborating and understanding what those facts might mean. So again, those high performing teams take time in the interpretation stage. The third phase is just as important, but is not needed to be as long or lengthy as the interpretation stage, and that's a projection. That's when the team looks into the future and tries to project and predict what the situation might unfold like. So it could include new challenges that might arise, and it might be able to establish some type of preparation and be proactive in responding or trying to prevent the evolving situation. When you do this type of information sharing with a team that is strong, you are able to make quick, accurate decisions. This is not just me saying it, also research that is tested, that's observed in a variety of different settings, in organizations, within military operations, and within government. The final thing that I think is really interesting is this idea of a knowledge tool. So as a leader, you should have been trained and learned how to facilitate. If not, I would encourage you to, because as a former teacher, I know that facilitating gets the most information and collaboration out of a team. And to do this is a tool such as a graphic display of the information. So as part of that communication structure, assign someone to take notes, even a simple whiteboard if you're in person. When you're on remote, there's actually whiteboards on as an option for webinars. You can provide a simple Word document or PowerPoint where someone can take notes or draw on. These knowledge tools give a way to represent the discussion and the facts. So this is going to help the different experts on your team engage in the facts, strategically think, interpret, move around the information in their mind to really have that collaboration of interpretation. So once you've gone through that successful information sharing process, you get to make decisions easier and faster. This final stage is going to take you into away from the initial stage of responding to the crisis and into the response crisis. This will lead you to other methods that we did not have time and would have been too dense to cover in this session. But we do hope that you are able to apply these initial things. So the current crisis of COVID-19 is still among us. If this has been helpful and you realize I didn't manage my message, I just dove in, I just wanted to give reassurance. I didn't even think about the reputation of my company. I didn't take advantage of that trust, or I didn't think about the fact that we had just had 3 recent crises internally. You always go back and go through the steps of identifying the type of crisis, understanding that history and reputation, and reframing your message to create that connection, the trust, the confidence, so you can go forward. Further, it's never too late to strengthen your teams. Whether that is understanding the diversity and differences in communication, whether that's getting in experts that you need to get additional information, whether that's in order to create a bond and a positive relationship among the influencers within those teams, you can always go back and do it. And you want to do it quickly, as quick as you can, so that you can build a strong foundation when you're making those decisions. And finally, I do hope that the information sharing process of this has been helpful. Again, there's a lot of tools that you can use to get facilitation. Getting the facts out in the open, having a strong team that's going to pull together, as we saw in Shackleton's expedition, in that Chilean mind. Both of the leaders were able to organize the teams, to give them meaning, for them to work together, to keep them distracted from the life and death situation that they were in, and for all of them to pull together. So I'm going to finish with one last example down in that Chilean mine. With those 2 days of ration, the group decided that every time they ate, they would sit in a circle, and each time they would all take out the tiny morsel that they were allowed to eat to ration out those days. They took it out together, visible to everyone, and then they ate together. And then they put the food back together in one place where no one else had access. This is an example of that human connection, of building the transparency, of building a bond. It's a very strong metaphor to me in a way that we need facts to come forward, for everyone to be able to open up, share what they have, be transparent about their resources in order for you to make decisions. So with that, I do hope that there is a lot of discussion and we can talk further about this. I hope this has been engaging, and the best part about webinars and building teams is the discussion. So I look forward to a lively Q&A. So I'm going to end the presentation sharing so that I can engage with the group.
So there is a question in the question and answer session. Trust is a major factor both in a crisis and in peace time. Can you give up tips how to build it?
Yeah, so of course it's ideal that we build trust in peacetime. So it always depends on the dynamic of your team. It goes back to when you're in a crisis, and I, again, like referring to Shackleton, I think this is a illustration. He destroyed the trust because he led them into the crisis. And so he had to quickly rebuild it. So the tips of building trust that I would say specifically for this is immediately pull your team together. Immediately assess that type. Okay, if you're Shackleton, you know you're at fault. You know that you're to blame and there's a reason not to be trusted. So you have to quickly make a message to reassure them in. So the leadership to show that I'm going to get us out of this. We're going to do this together. I have a plan and I have the capacity to play out that plan with you. And so he talked a lot about how he needed to manage what today we would call emotional intelligent leadership. This can be a bit of a soft skill, but it's really important. So there's this balance between being too rigid, such as a stoic or a distant leader, which is not going to establish that trust, especially in a crisis. But you also don't want the team to see any doubt, any fear that you'll inevitably have in a crisis. So it's this balance of being able to be transparent enough to recognize and empathize with the situation, but also demonstrating confidence that you have a plan. Including your team in the plan, as I said, by asking them what they know, by asking them how they understand the situation. But the leadership makes the decision. So you're working with the team, you're giving them roles, you know, as throughout this presentation, like I said, the main theme was structure. As a leader, you're guiding, you are structuring certain things, but yet you're also including your team, giving them purpose, making them part of. The illustrations that I gave were about the team coming together and acting together. Yet the leader was always very distinct. I think that there's a lot of leadership theories and a lot of situations where positional leadership, this idea, you're in the position, you're out in front, you're making the decisions and in control. Sometimes that can backfire in everyday life, but when you're in a crisis, it is really necessary and it builds trust when you do that. So in short, I would summarize the tips. Build the message where it's transparent, but yet confident. Include your team, give them roles, allow them to share facts and interpret them, but you be the one to make the decisions. I do like that question. So we have a question in our chat about getting rid of bad apples on the team. So this can be tricky, and quite honestly, it's very situational. I mean, there is situations where the bad apples can undermine absolutely everyone's safety, and if there is an opportunity in a way to get them off, maybe that would be appropriate. But often in a crisis situation, there's not this idea of getting rid of. So if it is this life or death, we're in this together, no one's going anywhere. If it is in a pandemic such as we're experiencing today, it might actually exasperate their influence by excluding them. So I'm going to take a quick example of an organization that the leadership was not involved in decision making. They were making their decision making and they were gathering facts on their own. And it left the team of subordinates directly below. And there was two leaders in that subordinate that what I kind of said was throwing a coup. They were not happy with the leadership. The leadership was not coming forth and engaging the team or communicating a regular message. They were not saying, we got this under control. And these two bad apples, so to speak, really took advantage of that, and they filled in the leadership gap, but they had a negative message. What the leadership needed to do was make sure there's not a void in leadership. And then they need to direct that. So that bad apples, they would have been much more better off. They had talent, right? They were able to respond, but the leadership needed to direct them. So it goes back to being able to create roles. In that situation, had I been that positional leader, I wouldn't have tried to get rid of them. I wouldn't have tried to stifle them away. I would have actually brought them closer. So there's a saying that keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. That would be what I would do in a crisis. So if there is somebody who is an influencer, and it could be positive, right? Like some of the most powerful people in a group do not have a positional role, but if they trust the positional leader, then they're going to be your most powerful ally in creating those positive dynamics and getting people to follow you. There's also a video that talks about this role of leadership, of followership. And so followership is a huge idea in leadership as well as in crisis leadership. So this video shows this crazy guy at this rock concert, and he's just walling out. He is just dancing and flailing his arms. And he could look like a crazy person, right? So as a leader, you take a risk. We often talk about us as leaders, we have to be the ones that put our neck out. And sometimes it doesn't work. And sometimes it does, but that's what's going to allow you to shine is having trust in yourself and maybe going against the grain and then getting others to follow you and trust in you. This guy is flailing his arms and just dancing, and people are videotaping him. And then one other person joins him and acts just as crazy, emulating his dancing, and they're enjoying it. And this so-called leader who started this dance, who didn't care what people thought of him, who was just enjoying the music, he gave positive reinforcement, high-fived the guy, brought him in, danced with him. And then about 15 seconds later, they had a crowd of 50 people dancing around them. And the point of this video is that that first follower, he's the influencer, he or she. That is the person the leader needs to focus on, because the crowds watch other people. What am I going to think of you? What is the reputation that I'm going to have of you? I'm going to look around at my team. What are they saying about you? Who appears to be the most important person within that team, and what are they saying? So as a leader in a crisis situation, identifying that person who is either going to dance with you or laugh at you, and knowing that the crowd will follow suit is really important. Is there any other questions or discussions that people wanted to mention? Any feedback on what was presented today?
Maybe how do you assess the European Commission in this crisis time? So they left it on the local states. So do you think it's a good decision or not?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
How do you assess the European Commission role in the current pandemic time?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Romina and I were having a discussion yesterday about how the pandemic has seen countries go inward, right? Rather than this coming together, in Europe, we've seen countries really focusing on themselves. So what is European Commission? What is the EU's role in it? So that is when you get into that is when I would go back to steps of what's the type of crisis? European Commission did not cause COVID-19. So they don't have to be blamed for, they don't risk being blamed for the actual crisis. It's just about how they handle it. The second step I would say is the level of trust among the different states and countries and the reputation of the European Commission, which is very much uneven within the different countries. So I would start with the messaging. If the European Commission decides we need to be part of this, we need to be responsive, we need to bring together. As there's been a lot of analysis, a virus that's worldwide, there needs to be more coordination. So this idea of us going inward is probably flawed, right? It's probably led by a lot of fear. And positional leaders probably have an instinct to want to take care of their own. That's who's going to be looking to them, who's going to be blaming to them. But at a foresight, the team, if you will, right? If we're looking at teams, the team is all of Europe. If it's going to affect, especially in the later stages of the crisis, when we want to open up. Sure, it's much easier when we're social distancing and we're in our homes. I would also say this is similar for the United States within each state, and within each city. So I believe that, I was talking earlier about this idea of leadership's crisis time is a time to shine. You want to be a leader, you want to be remembered, be a leader in crisis successfully. And I would argue that if the European Commission can handle the messaging with the political implications, with the history and the complicated dynamics of the different states and the different roles in history that a recent history that the European Commission has, and come together as a team itself, then they have a chance to really help the countries being able to both do the internal and external coordination of mitigating the virus, of being able to limit its spread, and be able to assess individual situations in cities, countries, and then be able to match it by bringing it together. And I'm assuming that we're gonna figure that out eventually. It's just how many times is leadership in all areas, all these positional leaders, whether you're a mayor, whether you are a provincial leader, whether you are a prime minister or part of the European Union or the European Commission or Congress in the United States, eventually we are going to have to work together. Sooner is always better. But again, it goes back to the question of trust. If there is a history of a lack of trust, especially in working together, and that information sharing. So there's been a lot of discussion on COVID-19 and how information was shared, whether it was with the World Health Organization or with China in the beginning, among different countries, then it just demonstrates the lack of relations that we have and how important trust is for that fact sharing to be forthcoming. So I think this crisis is going to allow for a lot of hindsight of how we do teams and how we coordinate. And my hope is that the European Commission can really be able to bring out the strategies and the theories of leadership, of mitigating a crisis, of being able to avoid making it a political, but rather a crisis of life and death where we come together in solidarity among all of our differences.
Thank you very much. I have one more question. If the person should be the leader or some public body can be leader as well. So in terms of commission, if you need one person in the commission who will be the leader, or you can be a leader as an organization or some public body.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say it's multi-layered in that the organization itself is absolutely a leader, and it needs to present itself as one, as a leader. Going back to even just the very small approaches that I talked about, the importance of that unification, and an organization definitely is a leader of this type that must itself present itself as a leader. However, I would say within that organization, you need to have, and again, this is why in peacetime, team dynamics, a lot of me and Ramina's work is often shoot away. And it's in crisis when you can pop up and say, oh, those soft skills, those team dynamics, understanding how they can work together and mitigate differences in culture and communication and styles and politics is really important. But we often don't take time for that. So then in a crisis team, I would immediately, if I was in the commission, set up a task force or a response team. If I was somebody looking in, advising them, I would select those that had a leadership reputation of building trust, of building solidarity, of not being divisive, and then being able to empower them to start a task force of within the organization. So this messaging that we're talking about, that needs to happen within the commission, and then the organization needs to do that outside of the commission, and everyone involved in that needs to be saying the same message to the external stakeholders. But within it, those positional leaders that have a reputation need to be empowered to start bringing people together. So a task force in doing this, and it's just layered, right? So at each step, so the small team is going to need to go through that messaging. What are we going to tell the larger team? You know, so the top leadership positions can organize, and this might not be the highest leader, right? Especially if there isn't responding. So knowing that small team, organizing themselves, organizing messages, understanding who is in the response team and why, what role do they have to fill, what expertise is needed, and then creating that leadership team. So, you know, as I talked about this idea of assessing the team, it's not something that you would think of doing, but this is exactly why you need to do it. And so then you organize that leadership team, and then that level, you do the same thing. What is going to be the messaging and why? What are going to be the teams and then the roles of those teams? So these stories that I tell, they hopefully make a bit of a more engaging presentation, but they also really serve the purpose of case studies. And so what did they do? They brought teams together. And when you're dealing with huge organizations, such as the commission, it's going to be multi-layered. And so each team is going to section off, but within that, in that layer, you're going to always need the messaging. You're going to need to know who makes up the team, what roles they're going to be given to fulfill. That naysayer influence is hugely important, but the message itself is important, because how you get those quote unquote bad apples, how you get the naysayers, how that the political infighting and the difference of opinion and philosophies of action, they need to be brought in and worked closely with and discussed with. And then within that, once you create a solid message for the organization, and everyone in that organization knows who the leader is, who who within those 5 commissions are going to play what roles, what exactly are the messages going to, and what are they going to be doing as they organize outside. President of the EU has a huge task.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it was quite interesting discussion with you. I will ask Peter, Peter Jirásek, if he has some closing remarks. Please, Peter. Okay, he doesn't hear me anymore. So thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you very much for discussion, and hopefully we will meet each other in better times.
Yes, I hope so as well. And stay safe, and I look forward to continuing this discussion.
Thank you very much. So thank you and goodbye.